Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku took over as Spider-Man after Peter Parker's fall. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It simply tore. One moment, Izuku Midoriya, the ninth wielder of One for All, was a symphony of controlled power. Green lightning, a familiar and comforting cloak, crackled around him. Black Whip, an extension of his will, lashed out to anchor a collapsing overpass while Float held him suspended against the sky bruised purple by the villain's quirk. Danger Sense was a high-frequency scream at the base of his skull, a constant, overwhelming alarm that he had learned to parse into a coherent battle strategy. He was in his element. Exhausted, battered, but in his element. Deku, left flank. He's solidifying. Kaken's voice was a guttural roar over the comms, punctuated by the concussive boom of an AP shot. On it! Izuku responded, his mind already 3 steps ahead. The villain, a man calling himself Paradox, was a nightmare. His quirk, Unravel, didn't just warp space. It treated reality like a loose thread on a sweater, pulling and twisting it until entire city blocks flickered between existence and a horrifying, kaleidoscopic nothingness. Buildings would stretch into impossible shapes, asphalt would melt into rivers of shimmering data, and the very air would hum with the stress of physics being torn apart. He's gathering energy for another big one. Izuku yelled, seeing the telltale shimmer coalesce around Paradox's hands. Kaken, we have to hit him now, together. Don't have to tell me twice, damn nerd. Izuku used Black Whip to slingshot himself forward, reeling in the kinetic energy. He charged One for All, feeling the familiar, roaring chorus of the previous wielder's surge within him. He prepared a 45% smash, aiming to disrupt, not destroy. But Paradox was faster than he anticipated. The villain's eyes, swirling pools of fractured light, locked onto Bakugo, who was mid-air, palms glowing orange as he prepared his ultimate move. Howitzer! Bakugo began, a feral grin on his face. Danger Sense erupted. It wasn't a warning. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated certainty. This next attack wasn't like the others. It wasn't a ripple. It was a vortex, a final, desperate gambit to tear a hole in everything. And its target was the single most explosive point on the battlefield, Katsuki Bakugo. There was no time for analysis. No time for a plan. There was only instinct, honed by 1,000 battles and a lifetime of wanting to save. Kaken! With a guttural cry, Izuku pushed Float to its absolute limit, rocketing across the 20-meter gap between them in less than a second. He slammed his shoulder into Bakugo's side, a brutal, ungraceful shove that sent his friend spiraling away from the epicenter. What the Deku? Bakugo's enraged, confused cry was the last thing Izuku heard from his world. Then, the vortex hit him. It wasn't pain. Pain would have been a mercy. It was deconstruction. He felt his atoms being pulled apart, his memories unfolding like a deck of cards thrown into a hurricane. He saw flashes of All Might's smile, his mother's tears, Uraraka's determined face, the burning embers of Shigaraki's hatred. He heard the voices of the vestiges, once a clear counsel in his mind, screaming as their connection to him was stretched thin, frayed like a rope about to snap. Nana Shimura's voice was the last to fade. Izuku, hold on. Then silence. A profound, absolute nothing, and then, everything came rushing back at once with the force of a physical blow. Izuku's return to consciousness was a brutal assault on the senses. The first thing he registered was the smell, a putrid cocktail of rotting garbage, stagnant water, and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. The second was the sound, a low, rhythmic drumming that he slowly identified as rain spattering against the metal lid somewhere above him. The third was the texture beneath his cheek, gritty, uneven concrete littered with what felt like broken glass. He groaned, a low, pained sound that was swallowed by the cavernous acoustics of the alleyway. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he tried to push himself up. His hero costume, once a symbol of hope and a marvel of support technology, was in tatters. The armored plates were cracked, the green fabric shredded, and his signature mask was gone entirely. His right arm gauntlet was a mangled wreck of wires and bent metal. Where am I? He forced his eyes open. The world was a blurry mess of dark brick and deep shadows. He was slumped at the base of an overflowing dumpster, rain slicking his matted green hair to his forehead. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and the oppressive shapes of towering buildings began to resolve themselves, their peaks lost in a low-hanging, slate-gray sky. This wasn't beautiful. The architecture was all wrong, older, grittier, a claustrophobic canyon of brick and fire escapes. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his exhaustion. Kakin? Uraraka-san? Anyone? His voice was a raw croak, hoarse and weak. Only the drumming of the rain answered. He needed to check his connection. It was his lifeline, his compass. He closed his eyes, shutting out the disorienting new reality, and reached inward, searching for that familiar, warm space where the previous wielders of One for All resided. Usually it was like walking into a sunlit room filled with powerful, reassuring presences. Now, it was a cavern. Vast, dark, and terrifyingly silent. He could feel a thread, a single, impossibly thin filament of light leading off into an infinite darkness. It was them. He could just barely sense them, like a faint echo from across a chasm, but they were distant, muted. He couldn't hear their voices, couldn't draw on their wisdom or their strength. No. He tried to activate One for All. He focused, calling on that familiar surge of power, picturing the green lightning encasing his limbs. A pathetic flicker of emerald light, barely visible in the gloom, sputtered around his fist for a split second before dying. It was like striking a damp match. The intent was there, but the fuel was gone. He tried again, pushing harder, gritting his teeth. A single, anemic spark jumped between his knuckles. That was it. The panic began to solidify into a cold, heavy dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. His quirk, no, their quirk, was broken. The dimensional tear had severed him from its source. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, stripped of his power in a world he didn't recognize. He leaned his head back against the cold, wet brick, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a profound sense of desolation. He had to get up. He had to find answers. But for a moment, he just let the rain wash over him, each drop a cold reminder of his isolation. After what felt like an eternity, the survival instinct that had been drilled into him by Aizawa-sensei, and honed in the war against the Paranormal Liberation Front finally kicked in. Lying here wouldn't solve anything. He needed information. Using the dumpster for support, he hauled his aching body to his feet. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to brace himself against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A quick self-assessment revealed a myriad of cuts and bruises, a possible concussion, and what felt like at least 2 cracked ribs. Nothing life-threatening, but debilitating without the regenerative boost One for All usually provided. He limped toward the mouth of the alley, the sounds of the city growing louder, more distinct. It was a symphony of unfamiliar noises. The aggressive blare of horns that had a different pitch than those in Japan, the screech of train wheels on elevated tracks somewhere nearby, and a cacophony of voices speaking a language he only partially understood. English. He'd studied it, of course, it was a required subject. But hearing it spoken this quickly, with so many different accents, was like being submerged in a tidal wave of sound. He peeked his head out from behind the dumpster, his eyes widening at the scene before him. He was in a city that made Tokyo look quaint. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds like steel and glass needles, their surfaces slick with rain. Yellow taxis, boxy and iconic, swarmed the streets like angry hornets. Steam billowed from manholes in the street, illuminated by the lurid glow of 1,000 neon signs advertising products and brands he'd never seen before. The sheer scale of it all was breathtaking and terrifying, but it was the people who truly unsettled him. They moved with a hurried, aggressive energy, a sea of faces that were closed off, guarded. No one made eye contact. They were islands in a rushing river, each focused solely on their own destination. It felt cold. Then he saw the first sign, taped to a lamppost. The paper already soggy and starting to tear, was a child's drawing. It depicted a figure in a red and blue suit, swinging on a line between 2 buildings. The crayon work was clumsy, but the image was iconic. Beneath it, in a child's scrawl, were the words, "We miss you, Spidey." Spidey? A hero's name, maybe? He pushed himself away from the alley wall and joined the flow of the crowd, his tattered, otherworldly costume earning him a few strange looks, but mostly, he was ignored. New York City, he would later learn, had a high tolerance for the bizarre. As he walked, the images became more frequent, more elaborate. A small, makeshift memorial had been set up in a recessed doorway. It was a collection of wilting flowers, flickering prayer candles, and handwritten notes protected from the rain by plastic sheets. "You are the best of us," one read. "Thank you for saving my son," said another. They were all addressed to someone called Spider-Man. Izuku's analytical mind, a tool he relied on as much as his quirk, began to whir, piecing together the clues. This city had a hero. A beloved hero. And something had happened to him. The past tense on all the notes, the mournful atmosphere, it felt disturbingly familiar. It reminded him of the days after All Might's retirement, the sense of a world suddenly without its greatest protector. But this felt heavier. This felt like grief. He turned a corner onto a wider, grander street. And then he saw it. It stopped him dead in his tracks, the bustling crowd parting around him like water around a stone. There, on the side of a 5-story brick building, was a mural. It was a masterpiece of spray paint and passion, covering the entire wall. It depicted the hero, Spider-Man, in a dynamic, soaring pose, one arm outstretched as if swinging right out of the wall and into the sky. The red and blue of his costume were vibrant, a splash of impossible color against the city's gray palette. He was lean, agile, a symbol of freedom and hope, and at the bottom of the mural, in stark, elegant white letters, were 2 dates. A birth year, and an end year. A date from only a few months ago. The dread in Izuku's stomach became a leaden certainty. Spider-Man wasn't retired. He wasn't missing, he was dead. "Can't believe it's been 3 months, a voice said nearby. Izuku turned to see 2 men in business suits huddling under an awning, looking up at the mural. "City's not been the same since he's gone." "Tell me about it," the other man replied, shaking his head. "The goblin took him down, but at least he took that monster with him. A hero till the end." "The goblin?" "Another villain. A fight. A sacrifice." The story was painfully, universally familiar. A hero had given his life to stop a great evil. Izuku felt a pang of profound empathy for this city he didn't know. He understood this loss. He knew what it was to lose a pillar of hope. He looked back at the mural, at the hero's masked face, and felt a strange kinship with the man he'd never meet. He, too, had a legacy to uphold. He, too, knew the weight of a symbol. He stood there for a long time, just watching, absorbing the city's sorrow. The rain began to fall harder, plastering his hair to his face, but he barely noticed. He was lost in thought, trying to process the impossible situation he found himself in. A new world, a dead hero, a broken power. What was he supposed to do? What could he do? As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, the city's underbelly began to stir. The shadows in the alleyways seemed to deepen, to lengthen. The hurried energy of the daytime crowds was replaced by a more scattered, nervous populace. People walked faster, clutching their bags a little tighter. Izuku, driven by a gnawing hunger and the need to find shelter, found himself wandering down a narrower, less crowded street. The neon signs here were flickering, some of them broken. The storefronts were grimy. It was on this street that he saw it. It happened in the blink of an eye. A woman, clutching a purse, walked out of a small grocery store. 2 figures detached themselves from a darkened doorway. One grabbed her, clamping a hand over her mouth, while the other snatched her purse. It was a simple, brutal mugging. The kind of crime that happened 100 times a day in a city this size. But for Izuku Midoriya, it was a call to action. His body moved before his mind could remind him of his weakness. The hero's instinct, the core of his very being, took over. He broke into a sprint, his tattered boots slapping against the wet pavement. "Hey! Stop that!" he yelled, his English clumsy but his intent clear. The 2 muggers turned, surprised. They were just men, not villains with monstrous quirks. One was tall and wiry, the other short and broad. They wore hooded sweatshirts and expressions of cruel annoyance. "Get lost, kid," the tall one snarled, brandishing a small knife. "This ain't none of your business." Izuku didn't slow down. He drew his arm back, focusing every ounce of his will, every memory of power, into his fist. He aimed for the wall beside the mugger's head, intending to create a crater, to intimidate, to end this without a real fight. He called on One for All. Please, just a little. Just give me 5%. For a heart-stopping moment he felt it. A flicker. A ghost of the power he once commanded. A faint wisp of green lightning danced around his knuckles. He threw the punch. His fist connected with the brick wall with a dull, wet thud. There was no crater. No shockwave. No shattered brick. There was only a sharp, radiating pain that shot up his arm from his knuckles to his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling back, clutching his hand. He'd broken at least 2 fingers. The muggers stared at him, then at the completely undamaged wall, and then at each other. And then they started to laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the narrow street. What was that, freak? The broad one chuckled. You trying to tickle the building? Shame, hot and overwhelming, flooded Izuku's chest. He was useless. Worse than useless. He was a joke. The tall one shoved the terrified woman to the ground and advanced on Izuku. You wanted to be a hero? Huh! He pushed Izuku hard in the chest. Without the anchoring power of One for All, Izuku was just a teenager, and he stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the slick pavement. Guess this city's fresh out of heroes, the mugger sneered down at him. He spat on the ground near Izuku's head. Come on, let's go. The two of them ran off into the darkness, the woman's stolen purse in hand. They disappeared into another alley, their laughter fading into the sounds of the city. Izuku lay on the ground, the cold rain seeping into his shredded costume, the pain in his hand a dull throb. The woman who had been mugged scrambled to her feet, shot him a terrified, pitying look, and then hurried away in the opposite direction, not even a word of thanks. Why would she thank him? He hadn't done anything. He had failed. He had faced down All for One. He had battled Shigaraki at the height of his power. He had saved a nation. And here, in this new world, he couldn't even stop a common street thug. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. He cradled his broken hand, the shame so heavy it felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He looked down the street where the muggers had fled, then back at the direction the woman had gone. He was standing in the middle of a void, a vacuum left by a fallen hero, and he, the most powerful hero of his own world, was completely and utterly powerless to fill it. He found the fire escape of a deserted tenement building and, with a great deal of effort, pulled himself up, climbing until he reached the roof. He collapsed onto the tarred surface, heedless of the puddles, and finally let the full weight of his situation crash down on him. The city spread out before him, a glittering, indifferent sprawl of light and shadow. He was a ghost here, a foreigner with no name, no home, and no power. The faint connection to the vestiges felt a million miles away. He was cut off. Adrift. He looked at his hands, the right one swollen and throbbing, the left scarred from 100 battles. These were the hands that All Might had entrusted with his legacy. These were the hands that were supposed to save everyone. Now they were just the hands of a boy, a lost boy, sitting on a rooftop in a world that wasn't his, in a city that was mourning a hero he could never be. The rain continued to fall, mingling with the hot, silent tears that finally traced paths down his soot-stained cheeks. He wasn't Deku, the hero. He wasn't the ninth wielder of One for All. He was just Izuku Midoriya. And he had never felt so alone. But even as despair threatened to consume him, a tiny, defiant spark flickered in his soul. It was the same spark that had driven him to rush toward a sludge villain with no quirk of his own. It was the ember of a hero's spirit, forged in fire and tempered by sacrifice. He didn't know how he was going to get home. He didn't know if he could ever fix his connection to One for All. He didn't know if he could survive a week in this harsh, unforgiving city. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. People were hurting here. And a hero, even a powerless one, could not stand by and do nothing. He had to try. He didn't know how, but he had to. He wiped the rain and tears from his face with the back of his good hand and looked out at the sprawling, wounded city. It was a world without a web, a world without its Spider-Man. And for now, it was his world too. The challenge was immense, seemingly impossible. But Izuku Midoriya had a long history of making the impossible his own. Of course. Here is the second chapter, a deep dive into Izuku's transformation and discovery, based on the provided outline. The night was a long, cold vigil. Izuku remained on the rooftop, a solitary figure huddled against the ventilation unit as the city's relentless energy hummed below. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, coating everything in a slick, reflective sheen. Each drop that landed on his skin felt like a tiny icicle, seeping the last of his warmth away. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache in his stomach, a physical manifestation of the hollowness he felt inside. He had tried, in the hours since his failed attempt at heroics, to reach back into the void where One for All should have been. It was an exercise in futility, like screaming into a vacuum. The single, faint thread of connection remained, but it was unresponsive, a dead line. He was a powerhouse with the power turned off at the main breaker, 1,000 miles away. The realization was a heavier burden than any physical injury. His quirk wasn't just his weapon, it was his identity, his promise to All Might, the culmination of his life's dream. Without it, what was he? Just a boy. A boy with a broken hand, a tattered costume, and no way home. As the first hints of a gray, washed-out dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the cold became unbearable. Survival, a primal and undeniable instinct, finally overrode his despair. He couldn't stay here. He needed shelter. A place to rest, to think, to splint his hand properly before the bones set wrong. He climbed down the fire escape, his movements clumsy and pained. The streets were quieter now, populated by early morning delivery trucks and the city's forgotten souls. He kept to the shadows, his strange attire now a source of deep shame rather than pride. He wandered aimlessly for what felt like hours, moving toward a section of the city where the gleaming skyscrapers gave way to old, forgotten industrial buildings, rusting brick behemoths with shattered windows and graffiti-scarred walls. It was a place of decay, a perfect reflection of how he felt. It was in this urban graveyard that he saw the name, faded but still legible, on the side of a large, condemned complex, Oscorp. The letters meant nothing to him, but the building itself was exactly what he was looking for. A high chain-link fence, topped with rusted barbed wire, surrounded the perimeter, but a section had been bent and pulled back, creating a narrow gap. It was an invitation to the desperate. He squeezed through, his torn costume snagging on the metal. The Oscorp facility was a ghost. Weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt of the parking lot. The main entrance doors were boarded up, but a smaller side entrance had been forced open long ago, its metal frame warped and twisted. Izuku slipped inside, into a world of dust and silence. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and old chemicals. Moonlight, filtered through grime-caked skylights, cast long, eerie shadows across the vast, open floor of what must have been a research laboratory. Desks and workstations were overturned, papers and shattered beakers crunching under his boots. It looked as if it had been evacuated in a hurry, then left to rot for years. It was a tomb of forgotten ambition. He found a relatively sheltered corner in what looked like a small office, away from the largest holes in the roof. His first priority was his hand. The pain was a constant, throbbing reminder of his powerlessness. He found a discarded metal ruler and some adhesive tape in a rusted desk drawer. With his teeth and his good hand, he clumsily began to fashion a crude splint, hissing in pain as he tried to align the broken bones in his fingers. He was so focused on the task, his world narrowed to the searing pain in his hand, that he didn't notice the room's other occupant until it was too late. It crawled out from a fissure in a shattered cylindrical containment unit on a nearby table. The glass of the unit was thick, but a single, spiderweb crack had allowed for its escape. It was unlike any spider Izuku had ever seen. It was about the size of his thumbnail, its body an unnatural mosaic of iridescent blue and deep crimson. Faint, intricate lines, almost like circuitry, glowed with a soft, internal bioluminescence, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. It was a creature born from a test tube, a fusion of biology and technology that had somehow survived the lab's demise. It moved with an unnerving purpose, crawling across the debris-strewn table, over a pile of moldering documents, and onto the edge of the desk where Izuku was working. He still hadn't seen it. He finally managed to wrap the last piece of tape around his makeshift splint, and he sighed. A small puff of air in the silent room. He slumped back in the chair, exhausted, resting his injured hand on the desk. The spider paused, its multiple eyes seeming to fix on the heat signature of his skin. Then it dropped. It landed silently on the back of his hand, its tiny legs barely registering against his skin. Izuku felt a faint tickle and glanced down, his eyes widening in surprise. Before he could react, to brush it off or even process what he was seeing, it bit him. A sharp, electric sting, far more intense than its size would suggest, lanced through his hand. Ah! Izuku yelped, jerking his hand back instinctively. The spider was flung against the wall, where it fell to the floor, a tiny, still speck of blue and red. He felt a pang of guilt for killing what was likely the only other living thing in the building. He looked at the bite mark. 2 tiny punctures, already swelling and turning an angry red. A strange, burning sensation began to spread from the spot, a warmth that traveled up his veins like a lit fuse. He felt a wave of dizziness, the room tilting precariously. Poison? He thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. Of all the stupid luck, his head swam. The edges of his vision blurred, darkening into a tunnel. The sounds of the lab, the distant dripping of water, the whisper of wind through broken panes, faded into a dull roar. He tried to stand, but his legs were made of lead. He slumped forward, his head hitting the hard surface of the desk with a crack. His last coherent thought was a bitter one. So this is it. Come all this way, just to die from a bug bite in a dusty room. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, All Might. Then the darkness took him, and he fell into a fever dream deeper than any sleep. It was a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of sensation and memory. He was untethered, drifting through a landscape of his own mind, remade and reshaped by an alien venom rewriting his very code. He saw flashes of his past, warped and distorted. All Might's triumphant smile, but his eyes were filled with a profound sorrow, as if he were looking at a ghost. Uraraka's face appeared, her voice calling his name, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side of a vast, echoing canyon. He saw Bakugo, screaming his name, not with anger, but with pure, desperate fear. These fragments were interwoven with new, strange imagery. Intricate, geometric patterns of webbing, glowing with ethereal light, spun themselves across his vision, connecting everything. He felt a phantom sensation of falling, a stomach-lurching plummet from an impossible height, followed by the jarring, life-saving thwip of a lion catching him at the last second. A sound began to build in the dream, a low, persistent hum that vibrated at the base of his skull. It was a chaotic symphony of information, 1,000 discordant notes of awareness. It was similar to Danger Sense, but broader, messier. It wasn't just a warning of imminent threat, it was everything. The shift of a loose brick on the roof above, the scuttling of a rat 3 floors below, the subtle change in air pressure as the wind picked up outside. He felt the faint threat of one for all within him, a lone beacon in the storm. And he felt the venom, the spider's genetic code, swarming around it, latching onto it. It wasn't overpowering the quirk, but integrating with it, using that dormant, otherworldly energy as a catalyst, an anchor in his soul. It was a bizarre and terrifying symbiosis. The ghost of a god-tier power was becoming the bedrock for something entirely new. A voice, a whisper from the dream's edge, echoed in the chaos. It wasn't one of the vestiges. It was someone new. A kind, tired voice, filled with an impossible weight. With great power. The whisper faded, leaving Izuku adrift in the humming, web-filled darkness. He woke with a gasp, his body jerking upright so violently that the cheap office chair he was in screeched back and toppled over. He landed on the floor in a tangled heap, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. For a moment, he was utterly disoriented. Then it all came flooding back, the alley, the mural, the mugging, the lab, the spider. He frantically looked at his hand, the one that had been bitten. The bite mark was gone. Not faded, not scarred over. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there. He flexed his fingers. The splint he had so painfully constructed lay in pieces on the floor. He made a fist. There was no pain. The bones, which had been definitively broken only hours ago, were perfectly healed. He scrambled to his feet, a profound sense of unease washing over him. What happened? He whispered to the empty room. He felt incredible. The exhaustion, the hunger, the deep, bone-weary ache were all gone. He was filled with a vibrant, thrumming energy that felt both familiar and alien. It wasn't the cosmic, explosive power of One for All. This was different. A dense, wiry strength that seemed to hum in his muscles and tendons. He reached out to steady himself against the heavy metal filing cabinet. His palm made contact, and he felt a strange, almost magnetic pull. He tried to lift his hand, and the entire cabinet, which must have weighed a few 100 pounds, tilted forward with a groan of protesting metal. Izuku yelped and snatched his hand back, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at his palm, then at the cabinet. He hadn't been trying to lift it. He'd just been stuck to it. Panicked now, he took a stumbling step backward. He thought the villain's quirk had done this to him, that this was some delayed, horrific mutation. It's tearing me apart, changing me. His heel caught on the leg of the fallen chair, and he lost his balance, pinwheeling his arms as he fell backward toward a solid brick wall. He braced for impact, flinging his hands behind him to soften the blow. His palms slapped flat against the brick. The impact never came. He stopped, his body hovering at a 45-degree angle to the floor, his weight supported entirely by his hands, which were pressed flat against the wall. He hung there for a full 5 seconds, his mind refusing to process what was happening. Slowly, tentatively, he peeled one hand off the wall. The sound was like ripping Velcro. He pressed it back, and it stuck fast. He did the same with the other hand. He could stick to walls. A wave of vertigo and nausea rolled through him. This was wrong. This wasn't a quirk. Quirks were a part of you, a natural extension of your biology. This felt grafted on. An invasion. No, this isn't real, he muttered, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He tried to push himself off the wall, but his feet just dangled uselessly. In his panic, he scrambled, and one of his feet, clad in his sturdy hero boot, pressed against the wall. It stuck. He tried the other. It stuck too. He was now clinging to the wall like an insect, parallel to the floor. The world had turned sideways. He looked down, or rather, across, at the dusty floor several feet away. The sheer impossibility of his situation short-circuited his panic, replacing it with a stunned, terrified silence. And then, the buzzing started again. It wasn't a dream this time. It was real, a high-frequency thrum at the base of his skull, a cacophony of sensory input that made his teeth ache. It was 1,000 tiny needles prickling his subconscious, screaming at him from every direction at once. Above left danger shift wait unstable crack, his head whipped up. A large section of the plaster ceiling directly above him, weakened by years of water damage, chose that exact moment to give way. Without thinking, Izuku reacted. He shoved himself away from the wall with all his strength, his new muscles coiling and releasing with explosive force. He sailed through the air, twisting his body, and landed in a perfect, silent crouch on a steel support beam on the far side of the room, a good 20 feet away. A shower of plaster and decaying wood crashed down on the exact spot where he had been clinging a second before, exploding in a cloud of choking dust. He stared at the debris, then at his hands. The buzzing in his head subsided to a low hum. It had warned him. That chaotic noise had given him a precise, specific warning. It was a danger sense, but wilder, more potent than the one he was used to. He sat there on the beam, high above the lab floor, for a long time, trying to breathe. The spider. It had to be the spider. Its venom hadn't killed him. It had changed him. It had given him its abilities, superhuman strength, the ability to adhere to any surface, and a precognitive danger sense. He had a quirk again. Or something like it. A new kind of fear, colder and more profound than his earlier panic, began to set in. He was losing himself. His body was no longer entirely his own, but beneath the fear, a tiny, guilty spark of something else ignited, relief. He wasn't powerless anymore. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he began to explore the lab, his new abilities making it effortless. He leaped from beam to beam, crawled across ceilings, his movements becoming more confident with each passing minute. This place was a tomb of science. Whatever experiments they had been doing here, they were radical. And they had been abandoned. Why? It was his new sense, the humming awareness, that led him to it. In a back corner of the main lab, behind a collapsed section of shelving, was a wall that felt wrong. The buzzing in his head sharpened whenever he faced it, a subtle dissonance that suggested the wall wasn't as solid as it looked. Curious, he jumped down and ran his hand over the grimy surface. It was concrete, solid and cold. He knocked on it. It was thick. But the sense persisted. He pushed on it. Nothing. Frustrated, he balled his fist and, remembering his earlier failure, punched it. This time, there was no painful thud. His fist, powered by his new, unnatural strength, smashed through the concrete as if it were drywall. A cloud of dust billowed out, and Izuku stared, dumbfounded, at the hole he'd created. Beyond it, there was darkness. A hollow space. He tore away more of the concrete, revealing a hidden doorway, its electronic lock long dead. He slipped inside. He had found a secret. The air in the hidden room was clean, circulated by a silent, solar-powered fan. A string of low-wattage emergency lights provided a soft, steady glow. This was no abandoned space. It was a hideout, small, cramped, and ruthlessly efficient. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a neatly folded blanket on top. A small workbench was covered in a chaotic but organized mess of tools, wires, and strange-looking mechanical components. On a small shelf sat a first aid kit, some non-perishable food bars, and several bottles of water. It was a Spartan, secret sanctuary, and on a simple mannequin in the corner stood a costume. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. It was him. The hero from the murals. Spider-Man. The suit was made of a strange, flexible material, the iconic red and blue design marred by a large, jagged tear across the chest, as if from a blade or shrapnel. It was a silent testament to its owner's final battle. Seeing it up close, so real and tangible, made the hero's death feel more immediate, more tragic. On the workbench, next to a soldering iron, lay a pair of intricate metal bracelets. They were clearly damaged, one of them cracked down the side. Izuku picked one up. It was heavier than it looked, a marvel of micro-engineering. He recognized components for high-pressure valves, a fluid chamber, and a sophisticated trigger mechanism on the palm. They were web shooters, a support item. This hero's power, his famous webs, hadn't been biological. He had created them, but it was the last item, sitting on a small desk beside the cot, that made Izuku's world stop. It was a thick, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled to the brim. It was almost identical to the dozen notebooks he had back in his own room, the ones he'd titled Hero Analysis for the Future. With trembling fingers, he reached out and opened it. The page was a flurry of elegant, slightly messy handwriting, complex chemical equations, and detailed schematics. The title at the top read, Web Fluid Formula V, 7.3 tensile strength and viscosity issues. Izuku's eyes scanned the page, his analytical mind firing on all cylinders. He saw notes on polymer chains, solvents, and the effect of air pressure on cohesion. It was brilliant, absolutely, stunningly brilliant. This wasn't just a hero, this was a scientific genius. He turned the page. It was a detailed, hand-drawn schematic of the web shooter, complete with annotations about trigger sensitivity and nozzle aperture for different web types, a thin line for swinging, a wide net for capture, a quick dissolving variant. He kept turning. And then he found it. A page dedicated to a villain. A detailed sketch showed a man in a high-tech flight suit with massive, mechanical wings. The name Vulture, Adrian Toombs, was written at the top. Below it were pages of meticulous notes. Flight patterns favor high-altitude dives. Turbine intakes are a potential vulnerability. Wing structure appears to be salvaged. Chitauri tech susceptible to electromagnetic pulse. It was a hero analysis notebook. Izuku sank onto the cot, the journal open in his lap, a sense of profound, overwhelming awe washing over him. He felt as though he was looking into a mirror. The same obsessive attention to detail, the same drive to understand an opponent before a fight, the same relentless pursuit of improvement. He flipped toward the back, where the notes became more personal. Scribbled in the margins were little snippets of the hero's life. Note to self: fighting a guy made of sand is terrible. It gets everywhere. New suit filters needed. Web fluid budget is getting out of control. Need to find a cheaper bonding agent. Maybe ask Dr. Connors? Aunt May is worried again. Saw the bruise on my cheek. Told her it was a handball accident. I need to be more careful. For her, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of him hit Izuku. This wasn't just a symbol on a mural. This was a person. A young man, by the sound of it, who was a genius, who fought incredible battles, and who still worried about his aunt. He made jokes. He struggled with money. He was brilliant, and brave, and so incredibly human. Izuku had been mourning a symbol, a fallen protector for a city of strangers. But now, reading this journal, he felt like he was mourning a friend. He felt a deep, heartbreaking connection to this Peter Parker, the name he finally found scrawled on the inside cover, a kindred spirit he would never have the chance to meet. He looked from the journal to the torn suit, then down at his own hands that now, by some impossible twist of fate, held a portion of this fallen hero's power. He was alone in a foreign world, stripped of his own legacy. But in this dusty, secret room, he had stumbled upon another one. An inheritance he never asked for, left behind by a hero who was so much like him. The despair that had crippled him since his arrival began to recede, replaced by something new. Something fragile, but fierce. A sense of purpose. He didn't know how he had gotten these powers, or if he'd ever get his own back. He didn't know if he could ever be the hero this city had lost. But as he sat there, in the quiet sanctuary of the amazing Spider-Man, Izuku Midoriya knew one thing for certain. He had to try. For the city that was hurting. And for the kindred spirit who had left his legacy behind. The analysis was done. Now, the work had to begin. Of course. Here is the third chapter, a detailed exploration of Izuku's process of becoming his own hero, filled with trials, failures, and the beginning of a new synthesis of power. The silence in the hidden lab was a sacred thing. For the first time since he'd been torn from his world, Izuku Midoriya felt a flicker of something other than despair or panic. It was a fragile, unfamiliar sensation, but he recognized it: purpose. He sat on the edge of the cot, Peter Parker's journal held in his hands with the reverence of a holy text. This was more than a notebook. It was a testament, a final will, a roadmap left behind by a hero. The sun had risen, and thin slivers of dusty light now pierced the gloom of the main lab outside. But in this small sanctuary, time seemed to stand still. Izuku spent the first hour simply reading, absorbing the mind of the man who had come before him. Peter's notes were a whirlwind of genius. He jumped from complex fluid dynamics to observations on the migratory patterns of birds to perfect his understanding of aerodynamics, then to frustrated doodles in the margins of a man with a ridiculous mustache yelling about him in a newspaper. Peter Parker had been brilliant, funny, and burdened. The weight of his responsibility was a constant, palpable undercurrent in his writing, but it was always buoyed by an unshakable optimism, a relentless drive to do the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do. It resonated with the core of Izuku's own heroic philosophy, the creed All Might had instilled in him. I can't be him, Izuku thought, tracing a complex schematic for an upgraded web shooter lens. It wouldn't be right. But I can learn from him. I can honor him. With a new resolve solidifying in his chest, he set Peter's journal aside respectfully and sought out the scattered, moldering papers in the main lab. He found a stack of surprisingly well-preserved engineering schematics, blank on the back. With a scavenged pen, he began his own work. At the top of the first clean page, he wrote the familiar, comforting title, Hero Analysis for This World, Notebook 1. The work that followed was a grueling, frustrating, and utterly engrossing process of deconstruction. He was no longer a hero with a divine power. He was a scientist, an engineer, a student. His first and most critical task was to replicate Peter's most essential tool, the web fluid. Peter's journal contained the formula, a dizzying list of chemical compounds and precise procedural steps. Izuku, armed with a high school chemistry education and the practical knowledge gained from May Hatsum's explosive tutorials, felt he had a fighting chance. The real challenge was acquiring the ingredients. The abandoned Oscorp lab was a treasure trove. While most of the advanced projects had been cleared out, basic chemical storage had been left to rot. He found cabinets filled with beakers, Bunsen burners with half-full gas canisters, and shelves of dusty chemical jars. It was a miracle of preservation and neglect. He spent the better part of a day cross-referencing Peter's list with the faded labels on the jars, carefully measuring out powders and liquids. His makeshift lab was a corner of the main floor, cleaned and organized with obsessive precision. His first attempt was an unmitigated disaster. He followed the formula as best he could, mixing the compounds in a large beaker over a low flame. The result was not a high-tensile polymer. It was a thick, foul-smelling, gray sludge that had the consistency of lukewarm oatmeal. He dipped a metal rod into it and pulled it out. The goo dripped off in a pathetic, lumpy strand before plopping back into the beaker. Okay, that's fine," he muttered to himself, his analytical mind kicking in. Note 1. Miscalculation of solvent evaporation rate. The mixture achieved viscosity far too quickly, preventing proper polymer chain formation. He scribbled the note down, the act of analysis a calming ritual. Attempt number 2 was even more frustrating. He adjusted the heating curve and the introduction of the primary bonding agent. This time, the mixture was a near-perfect, clear fluid. A thrill of excitement shot through him. He carefully poured a small amount into a petri dish. It solidified almost instantly into a thin, crystalline film. Too perfect. He poked it with the rod. It shattered like glass. Too brittle. He sighed, slumping his shoulders. Cross-linking was too rapid. The tensile strength is non-existent. He documented the failure with a sigh, adding a sketch of the fractured polymer structure. The third attempt was the most infuriating of all. He managed to create a fluid that was both strong and flexible. He tested a strand between two clamps, and it stretched beautifully, holding a surprising amount of weight. Success. Elated, he began to transfer the sticky fluid into one of the empty web cartridges he'd found on Peter's workbench. In his haste, a small amount dripped onto his gloves. He didn't think much of it until he went to pick up another tool and found his hands were stuck together. He pulled. They wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, grunting with effort. The adhesive was phenomenally, ludicrously strong. He spent the next 20 minutes in a comical, desperate struggle, finally managing to pry his hands apart by anchoring one to a heavy table and pulling with all his spider-enhanced might. The sound was like a car door being torn from its hinges. Note 3. He wrote, flexing his sore fingers. Adhesive properties, too effective. Requires a non-stick coating for handling. And maybe a solvent for emergencies. He was about to give up for the day, his stomach rumbling, when his eyes fell on a small, almost illegible annotation in the margin of Peter's journal. It was next to a diagram of the web cartridge's internal pressurization system. It read, "Key isn't just a mix, it's the shear thinning properties under pressure. Fluid solidifies on contact with air after rapid depressurization." Duh, Parker! Izuka's eyes went wide. It wasn't just a chemical formula. It was a chemical reaction triggered by a specific physical process. The web fluid was designed to be a liquid inside the high-pressure cartridge, and only become a solid when fired through the nozzle. He had been focusing entirely on the end product, not the process. With renewed vigor, he created a new batch, this one slightly less viscous. He then turned his attention to the web shooters themselves. Peter's were damaged, but one seemed salvageable. Izuka took it apart piece by piece, laying the microscopic components out on a clean cloth. He was in awe. The turbine that fed the fluid, the solenoid that controlled the nozzle aperture, the palm-activated trigger that required a specific double tap to prevent accidental firing. It was a work of art, as intricate and brilliant as any piece of support gear Hatsum had ever shown him. Using tools from Peter's bench, he carefully cleaned the components, repaired the cracked casing with a powerful epoxy, and recalibrated the pressure regulator. He loaded his newest, hopefully correct, batch of web fluid into a cartridge, his hands moving with the steady focus of a surgeon. He snapped the cartridge into the shooter, sealed it, and strapped the device to his wrist. He took a deep breath, aimed at a far wall, and mimicked the double-tap firing motion he'd seen in Peter's diagrams. Thwip. The sound was quiet, but it echoed in the vast, silent lab like a gunshot. A perfect, silvery white line of webbing shot across the room, impacting the far wall with a satisfying splat. He tugged on the line. It was strong. Incredibly strong. He pulled harder, putting his full weight into it. The line held, taut and unyielding as a steel cable. A huge, shaky grin spread across Izuku's face. It was the first genuine smile he'd had since arriving in this world. He had done it. His next task was the suit. He stood before the mannequin holding Peter's torn costume. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just inches from the fabric, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. This suit was a uniform, yes, but it was also a shroud. It was the last thing Peter Parker had worn. It was a symbol of a sacrifice Izuku had no part in, to where it would feel like a lie, a desecration of a sacred memory. This isn't my legacy to claim, he thought with a heavy finality. But I can build my own. He turned to his own costume, the ruined remains of his identity as Deku. It was shredded and stained, but the advanced fibers it was woven from were still remarkably durable. He began a new process of deconstruction, this time on himself. With a sharp tool from the workbench, he carefully cut away the usable sections of the green fabric. He salvaged the armored plates from his iron saws and the mangled gauntlet on his arm. They were cracked, but the base material was sound. For hours he worked. He was not a tailor, and his stitching, done with a heavy-duty needle and wiring he'd repurposed, was crude and thick. But it was strong. He started with a pair of dark, durable work pants and a long-sleeved shirt he found in a locker, dyeing them black with ancient ink from a printer cartridge. This would be the base layer, practical and stealthy, reminiscent of the darker, more desperate look he'd adopted during his vigilante phase. It felt appropriate for this new, grim reality. Over this, he began to integrate his identity. He stitched the salvaged, armored green fabric into key areas, a stylized, delta-shaped pattern over the chest that mimicked his own costume's design, and reinforced panels on his shoulders and thighs. He took the metal plates from his boots and strapped them to his shins, creating makeshift greaves. The red was for Peter. He found a roll of durable, red canvas material in a supply closet and began the painstaking process of adding accents. He created a spider emblem for his chest, not Peter's elegant, familiar design, but a new one. It was blockier, more angular, with 8 sharp legs radiating from a central point that echoed the shape of his own Deku insignia. He added red panels to his sides and fashioned a red utility belt from the same material, a place to hold his spare web cartridges. The final piece was the mask. His own was gone, save for a few tattered remnants, but in a small box on Peter's desk, he found a collection of spare parts, including several pairs of expressive, white eyepiece lenses. He took the largest piece of his old mask, the part that resembled All Might's jagged smile, and integrated it into a full-face mask he fashioned from the black base layer fabric. He carefully stitched Peter's lenses into the eye sockets. They were large, almost insect-like, capable of emoting in a way that felt familiar and right. When he was done, he held it up. It was a strange, hybridized thing. A patchwork of 2 worlds, 2 legacies. He put it on, the rough-stitched fabric scratching at his skin. He looked at his reflection in a shard of broken glass. He saw neither Deku nor Spider-Man. He saw something new, something born of necessity and respect. The color scheme was dark, predominantly black and forest green, but the red emblem on his chest and the stark white eyes were an unmistakable declaration. It was a suit that said, "I am not him, but I will carry on his fight." Now came the final, most terrifying test. Theory, engineering, and design were all well and good. But it all meant nothing if he couldn't do what Peter Parker had made look so effortless. He had to swing. That night, he climbed to the top of the tallest building in the industrial district. The city spread out before him, a breathtaking, terrifying ocean of light. The wind was cold and sharp at this height, whipping at his new costume. He walked to the edge of the roof, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Down below, cars looked like tiny, flowing embers in the city's arteries. He took a deep breath, the filtered air hissing in his mask. "Okay, Izuku. Analyze. It's a physics problem. A pendulum arc. You just have to calculate the trajectory, the release point, account for wind resistance." His analytical mind was a shield against the primal fear of the drop. He looked at the building across the street, a slightly shorter structure about 50 yards away. He raised his arm, his web shooter aimed at a sturdy-looking flagpole near its roof. He double-tapped his palm. Thwip! The web line shot out, a silver thread in the darkness, and connected perfectly. He gave it a hard tug. It held. This was it. The moment of truth. For you, Parker-san, he whispered, a quiet promise to the ghost he felt watching over him. He took a running start, his mind screaming at him that this was a terrible, insane idea. He reached the edge of the roof and leaped. For a glorious half-second, he felt like he was flying. The wind roared in his ears, and the city lights swirled below. Then, gravity brutally reasserted itself. He had miscalculated. He hadn't jumped out, he had just jumped off. Instead of a graceful pendulum swing, the web line went slack for a terrifying moment before catching his weight. He didn't swing forward. He swung down, crashing hard into the brick facade of his own building several floors below the roof. The impact was a full-body explosion of pain, knocking the wind from his lungs. If not for his enhanced durability, he would have been a smear on the wall. He hung there, dangling like a broken puppet, his face pressed against the cold, unforgiving brick. But his new power saved him. Instinctively, his free hand and both feet slammed against the wall, and they stuck. He clung there, hard hammering, every muscle screaming in protest. Humiliation and terror warred within him. He looked down. The street was still hundreds of feet below. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He pressed himself flatter against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. It looked so easy in the drawings. Peter's notes were filled with sketches of him soaring, a creature of the air. But the reality was this: a clumsy, terrified boy clinging to a wall, a hair's breadth from a fatal mistake. Peter hadn't just had powers, he'd had an incredible, innate spatial awareness, a gymnast's grace that Izuku, a ground-based fighter, simply did not possess. I can't do this, he thought, the despair a cold, creeping thing. I can't be him. I'm a fraud. He hung there for a long time, the wind whistling around him, mocking his failure. He was about to start a slow, shameful crawl back to the roof when a thought sparked in his mind, born from the depths of his analytical process. Peter was a genius, but he didn't have my foundation. Our powers aren't the same. So why am I trying to use them the same way? Peter had relied on grace, momentum, and the physics of the swing. But Izuku had something else. It was a ghost, a whisper of what it once was, but it was there. One for all. He looked up at the web line, still anchored above him. He looked at the building across the street. A new plan, a crazy, reckless plan, began to form in his mind. He couldn't swing like Peter, but maybe he didn't have to. He took a deep, steadying breath, pushing the fear down. He closed his eyes and reached for that faint, flickering ember of his quirk. He focused, picturing the green lightning, not as a cloak or a weapon, but as a propellant. A launch pad. Just a tiny burst. 3%. Maybe 5% if he could manage it. Not a smash. A kick. He crawled a few feet down the wall, giving himself some slack on the web line. He planted his feet firmly against the brick, bending his knees, coiling his body like a spring. He felt it. A pathetic, but present, flicker of emerald energy crackled around his legs. It was barely visible, a faint green fizz, but he could feel the familiar warmth, the ghost of that limitless power. Analyze. Adapt. Overcome. He let go of the wall with his hands, his full weight now on the web line. He took one last look at his target, the rooftop across the way. Shoot style. He whispered into his mask, the name of his technique a familiar comfort. And then he kicked off the wall with all his might, augmented by that tiny, explosive burst of one for all. The result was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was a controlled explosion. He was launched from the wall like a cannonball, the web line snapping taut with a sound like a bullwhip. The G-force was immense, slamming him back. He didn't swing in a gentle arc. He was catapulted across the gap, a green and black blur. The wind shrieked past him, and the city became a smear of neon and shadow. For a terrifying moment, he thought he had overdone it, that he would slam into the opposite building with the same disastrous result. But his new spider sense screamed at him, a clear, concise burst of information, Apex. Now. Release. He let go of the webline at the absolute peak of the arc. He was airborne, weightless, sailing through the night sky high above the street. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating second of his life. Another building loomed before him. He aimed, fired his other web shooter. Thwip! It connected. He used the momentum, planting his feet against the side of the new building and kicking off again, another tiny burst of OFA giving him a violent, breathtaking boost of speed. He was doing it. He was swinging. It was nothing like Peter's graceful, aerial ballet. This was brute force. It was a series of controlled, explosive launches, using the webs as grappling hooks more than pendulums. It was messy, jarring, and probably looked ridiculous, but it was working. And it was his. He chained another swing, and another, a wild, disbelieving laugh bubbling up in his chest. He soared over the rooftops, the city lights a river of stars beneath him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated freedom. For the first time since that villain had torn a hole in his reality, he wasn't a lost boy or a failed hero. He wasn't just Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless wonder. He wasn't just Deku, the burdened successor, and he wasn't trying to be Spider-Man, high above the sleeping city, swinging through the concrete canyons on a thread of his own creation, powered by a fusion of two worlds. He was something entirely new, and he was ready for whatever this world had to throw at him. Of course. Here is the fourth chapter, focusing on Izuku's first tentative steps as a hero in this new world, the reactions he elicits, and the rise of a new threat. The first week was a blur of shadows and rooftops. Izuku moved like a phantom through the city's nocturnal hours, his existence a rumor whispered on the cold night wind. He was a creature of trial and error, learning the intricate geography of New York not as a citizen, but as a high-flying predator. Each night was a lesson in physics and fear. He learned which cornices were crumbling, which water towers offered the best vantage points, and which alleys were too narrow for his explosive, ricocheting style of movement. His swings became less about wild, desperate lunges and more about a controlled, brutalist parkour. He would use a burst of one for all to launch himself, not into open air, but into a wall run, his feet adhering to the brick as he sprinted horizontally for 50 feet before kicking off again, using a web line to pivot around a corner with a jarring, gravity-defying twist. It was a style born of his own history, a mix of Gran Torino's ricocheting movement, the aerial control of float, and the grappling utility of Black Whip, all funneled through the new, strange lens of his spider powers. It was ugly, but it was effective. During the day, he was just as much a ghost. He subsisted on the emergency rations from Peter's hideout, and refilled water bottles at public fountains. He spent the sunlit hours in the dusty sanctuary of the Oscorp lab, poring over Peter's notes, practicing his chemistry, and filling his own notebook. He documented everything, from the tensile strength of his latest web fluid batch to sketches of the city's skyline, marking optimal routes and potential dead zones with no anchor points. His new spider sense was a constant, low-grade hum in his skull, a background static of the city's life. It was overwhelming at first. He had to learn to filter it, to discern the sharp spike of a legitimate threat from the background noise of a near-miss traffic accident, or a pigeon flying too close to his head. It was a muscle, and he was slowly, painstakingly, learning how to flex it. But analysis and training could only take him so far. He had a responsibility, a purpose he had sworn to himself on that first lonely night. He had to help. So he began to act. His first real encounter was almost a comedy of errors. Perched atop a brownstone in a neighborhood called Brooklyn, his spider sense gave a sharp, distinct jolt. Below, in a dimly lit street, a man was trying to jimmy the lock on a parked car. It was a petty, almost mundane crime, but it was a starting point. Izuku took a deep breath. Okay. Be a hero. He dropped from the roof, not with a swing, but with a silent, controlled fall, landing in a perfect crouch on the pavement behind the would-be thief. The man, a scrawny figure in a worn-out leather jacket, was so focused on the lock that he didn't hear a thing. Izuku cleared his throat. Excuse me? The man yelped, spinning around, his lockpick clattering to the ground. His eyes went wide as he took in the sight before him, a figure clad in dark green and black, with a stark red spider on his chest and huge, unblinking white eyes. "What the hell are you?" the man stammered, scrambling backward. Izuku, falling back on the ingrained politeness his mother had drilled into him, took a half-step forward and gave a slight, awkward bow. "I'm sorry to startle you, but I don't think that's your car, sir. It would be very improper for you to take it." The thief stared at him, bewildered. "Improper? Who the hell says improper? It's just, you shouldn't steal," Izuku said, his voice earnest, slightly muffled by the mask. "It's not a very heroic thing to do. For you, I mean." This was not going as planned. He was supposed to be intimidating. Instead, he sounded like a guidance counselor. The thief, seeing not a terrifying vigilante but a strangely polite teenager in a bizarre costume, seemed to regain a sliver of his courage. He pulled a small switchblade from his pocket, the blade flicking out with a click. "Get lost, freak, before I get you," Izuku sighed. His spider sense gave a lazy buzz, a bored hum that told him the knife was no real threat. He raised his wrist. Thwip! A thick glob of webbing shot out, encasing the hand holding the knife in a sticky white cocoon. The thief stared at it, his jaw hanging open. He tried to pull his hand free, but it was useless. Izuku fired another shot, pinning the man's other hand to the brick wall of the building behind him. "There," Izuku said, a little more confident now. "That's much better. Now please wait here. I believe the proper authorities will be along shortly." He looked at the man, now completely immobilized. "I do apologize for the inconvenience." With that, he fired a web line at the roofline and launched himself into the air, leaving the utterly baffled car thief webbed to a wall, muttering. "He apologized to me." Word began to spread. At first, it was just whispers in the criminal underworld. A new player in the city. Some kind of freak who stuck people to walls and then said sorry. Descriptions were vague and contradictory. Some said he was a monster, crawling on ceilings like a bug. Others said he was just a kid, his voice cracking with nervousness. The public sightings were just as confusing. A blurry cell phone video showed a dark figure sprinting horizontally across the face of a skyscraper. A terrified witness to a purse snatching described a green and black demon who dropped from the sky, webbed the thief to a lamppost, returned the purse with a polite nod, and then vanished. He was a ghost, an urban legend in the making. He was clumsy. He was awkward. He was overly apologetic. He once stopped a robbery at a corner store and ended up paying for the pack of gum the robber had dropped, insisting that the store owner shouldn't be out of pocket. He wasn't the slick, confident Spider-Man the city remembered. This new hero was weird. In the bustling, chaotic newsroom of the Daily Bugle, Mary Jane Watson stared at the grainy photo on her monitor, her coffee growing cold in her hand. The image had been sent in by an amateur photographer, a lucky shot taken from a high-rise apartment window. It showed a figure in mid-swing, silhouetted against the setting sun. The quality was terrible, but the details were just clear enough: the familiar, arachnid-like form, the web line, the impossible acrobatics. But the colors were all wrong. The suit was dark, not the bright, hopeful red and blue she knew better than her own reflection. "Another one, MJ?" her editor, Robbie Robertson, asked, leaning over her shoulder. He was a kind, weary man who had seen it all, and his face was etched with a familiar sadness whenever the subject of Spider-Man came up. "This is the clearest shot yet," MJ said, her voice tight. She zoomed in, the image pixelating into a meaningless block of color. "Everyone's calling him the new Spider-Man. Or the Spider-Ghost. Something is out there, Robbie, and you think it's a copycat." Robbie finished for her. It wasn't a question. "Of course it is," she snapped, a little harsher than she intended. She softened her tone, running a hand through her vibrant red hair. Peter's gone. Anyone else claiming his name, wearing his symbol, it's a disgrace. It's an insult to everything he stood for, everything he died for. The 3 months since Peter's death had been a hollow, colorless eternity for her. The grief was a physical weight, a constant ache in her chest. She had thrown herself into her work as an investigative journalist, not as a distraction, but as a continuation of his mission. Peter had fought for the little guy in the suit. She would fight for them with her words. But these rumors, these sightings of a new spider-themed vigilante, felt like a personal violation. Peter's legacy wasn't a costume to be picked up by the next thrill-seeker. It was a sacred, painful memory. She had seen him come home with broken ribs and a smile, seen him sew up his own suit at their kitchen table, seen the unbearable weight of the world on his young shoulders. No one had the right to pretend they could carry that. JJJ is having a field day, you know, Robbie said, gesturing toward the blaring television in the corner of the newsroom. On the screen, Jonah Jameson's face was a mask of purple-tinged fury, his trademark mustache twitching with indignation. He was in the middle of one of his regular tirades on his fact news channel. "And now this imposter!" Jonah bellowed, slamming a fist on his desk. "This cowardly, skulking ghoul dares to swing through our city, wearing a cheap imitation of a hero's symbol. Let me be clear, this is not a tribute. This is a desecration. This spider menace, this spider shade, is nothing but a vulture picking at the corpse of a true hero's legacy. He's probably some deranged fanda, or worse, a criminal trying to use Spider-Man's image to his own nefarious ends. He is not a hero, he is a public menace, and I won't rest until he is unmasked and brought to justice." MJ muted the television, a headache forming behind her eyes. While she despised Jameson's vitriol, a small, dark part of her agreed with his core sentiment. This new figure was an unknown, a variable, and in a city still reeling from its loss, variables were dangerous. "I'm going to find him, Robbie," she said, her voice low and determined. "I'm going to find out who he is and what he wants." "And then what?" "And then," MJ said, her eyes hard as steel, "I'm going to make him stop." Her investigation began that night. She compiled every sighting, every rumor, every blurry photo. She created a map of the city, marking the locations and times of the ghost's appearances. A pattern began to emerge. He operated almost exclusively at night. His movements were erratic, but there was a loose concentration of activity in the older, more neglected parts of the city: Hell's Kitchen, the industrial zones on the west side, the forgotten corners of Queens. She spent her nights on the streets, her press pass and a high-powered camera her only companions. She listened to police scanners, chasing down reports of strange disturbances, always arriving a few minutes too late, finding only a webbed-up criminal and a handful of bewildered witnesses. "He was so polite," a bodega owner told her after his store was saved from an armed robber. "Tied the guy up, then asked me if my cat, who was hiding under the counter, was all right. Called him a very brave little fellow." It was these details that were the most jarring. The sheer power. Witnesses described him as impossibly fast and strong, contrasted with this bizarre, almost gentle personality. It didn't fit the profile of a hardened vigilante or a glory hound. It was a puzzle, and MJ was determined to solve it. Miles below the city's shimmering skyline, in a workshop that smelled of ozone and hot metal, Adrian Toombs was also taking notice of the new ghost. His operation was a thing of brutal efficiency. Housed in a cavernous, abandoned warehouse in the industrial waterfront, his crew, men like the tinkerer Finis Mason and the enforcer Herman Schultz, worked to salvage, reverse engineer, and weaponize the alien technology left over from the Chitauri invasion years ago. It was a dangerous, highly lucrative business. For years, one man had been a constant thorn in his side, a red and blue pest who had cost him millions in lost salvage and damaged equipment: Spider-Man. Toombs had respected him, in a way. The man had been relentless, incorruptible. His death, at the hands of that maniac Osborn, had been an unexpected boon. With Spider-Man gone, the city's underbelly had relaxed. The police were overwhelmed, and the other so-called heroes were too busy with world-ending threats to bother with a humble salvage crew. Business was booming. "The new guy was spotted in Queens last night," Schultz said, his voice muffled by the welding mask he was adjusting. "Took down a couple of the boys trying to move that anti-grav stabilizer." Toombs didn't look up from the complex circuitry he was soldering. He was perched atop his flight suit, the vulture armor, its massive wings folded behind him like a sleeping bird of prey. The suit was his life's work, a masterpiece of scavenged tech and engineering genius. "Did they get a good look at him?" Toombs asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Nah. Said he moved like smoke. Dropped out of nowhere, webbed them up before they could even get a shot off with the shocker gauntlets." Bryce said he was apologetic. Toombs finally paused, setting his soldering iron down. He turned, his cold, calculating eyes fixing on Schultz. Apologetic? Yeah. Weird, right? Told them they should reconsider their career choices for a more positive societal contribution. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped Toombs' lips. A do-gooder. A bleeding heart. He had been worried this new spider was a rival, another player trying to carve out a piece of the city's tech market. But this was something else. A child, most likely. Someone playing dress-up. He had built his empire on a simple philosophy. The world was a carcass, and the strong, the smart, the ones who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, were the vultures who feasted. Men like Tony Stark and the other so-called heroes looked down on him from their ivory towers. But he was a survivor, a provider for his family and his crew. He took what the world discarded and made it his own. Spider-Man had been a problem because he understood that. He had been a creature of the streets, just as much as Toombs was. He had interfered not out of some lofty ideal, but because he saw Toombs as a direct threat to his neighborhood, his people. This new bug was different. He sounded soft. Unfocused. This isn't a problem, Toombs declared, standing up and stretching. This is an opportunity. His crew looked at him, confused. This city is on edge, Toombs explained, his voice taking on the tone of a predator lecturing its young. They're grieving. They're looking for a sign. And now this Echo shows up. He's weak. He's hesitant. He's going to make a mistake. And when he does, we're going to be there to show the whole city that their heroes are gone for good. The sky doesn't belong to spiders anymore. It belongs to us. He gestured to a massive piece of salvage in the center of the workshop, a Chitauri energy core, pulsating with a dangerous, unstable blue light. It was their biggest score yet, lifted from a supposedly secure transport just last week. We're moving on the memorial site, Toombs announced. There's a whole wing of a Leviathan buried under the rubble there. The energy signatures are off the charts. It's a gold mine. Boss, that's hallowed ground, Phineas Mason mumbled, looking nervous. The city's been treating it like a graveyard. Toombs' gaze snapped to Mason, cold and hard. Graveyards are for the dead. We're alive, and we've got work to do. Let the ghost have the alleys and the corner stores. We're going after the real prize. He stepped toward his flight suit, a grim smile on his face. He felt an exhilaration he hadn't felt in months. The hunt was on again. This new spider wasn't a threat to be managed. He was a symbol to be broken. Izuku was perched on the head of a stone gargoyle overlooking a quiet street, his notebook open on his lap. He was sketching the flight pattern of a nighthawk, marveling at its silent, efficient movements. He was learning. Every night, he felt his control over his new powers growing, the synergy between the spider abilities and the ghost of one for all becoming more natural. His spider sense had been a low, anxious hum all evening, a persistent static that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't a spike of immediate danger, but a pervasive sense of wrongness, like the feeling of being watched. He was so lost in his thoughts, in the quiet solitude of the rooftop, that he almost missed it. A flicker of movement in the alley across the street. His head snapped up, his white lenses widening. He saw two figures, dressed in dark clothing, attempting to pry open the back door of a jewelry store. Another one, he thought with a sigh. It felt like he was trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. He stopped one crime, and two more sprang up in its place. He closed his notebook, tucked it securely into a pouch on his belt, and prepared to move. This time, he would be more efficient. No apologies, no lectures. Just swift, decisive action. He was about to leap when his spider sense screamed. It wasn't the usual jolt. It was a physical blow, an ice-cold spike of pure terror that lanced through his skull. It was a primal, absolute warning of imminent, lethal danger from above. Instinct, not thought, took over. He threw himself sideways, rolling off the gargoyle just as something massive and dark sliced through the air where he had been a split second before. There was a sound like a guillotine blade, a vicious shriek of metal on air, followed by the sickening crunch of stone as the gargoyle's head was sheared clean off. Izuku landed hard on the rooftop below, scrambling to his feet, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. He looked up. Hovering in the air, silhouetted against the moonless sky, was a monster. It was a man, but he was dwarfed by the massive, articulated metal wings strapped to his back. They spanned at least 20 feet, a terrifying construction of turbines, salvaged metal, and glowing green lights. The man wore a heavy flight suit and an old pilot's helmet with glowing green optics. A low, menacing whirring sound emanated from the turbines on his back. It was the Vulture. The man from Peter Parker's notebook. So, the Vulture's voice crackled through a speaker in his helmet, a low, mocking drawl. The little ghost finally decides to show his face. Or mask, as it were. Izuku stared, his mind racing. He had studied Peter's notes. He knew this villain's name, his flight patterns, his potential weaknesses. But theory was a world away from this terrifying reality. The sheer presence of the man, the predatory way he hung in the air, was something a notebook could never convey. "You're Adrian Toombs," Izuku said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. The Vulture seemed surprised. "Heard of me, have you?" "I'm flattered." He tilted his head. "You know, I had a real problem with the last guy in the spider suit. A real pest. But you don't feel like a pest. You feel like a meal." The two thieves in the alley, forgotten, had stopped their work and were staring up in awe and terror. This was out of their league. Izuku's mind was a whirlwind of analysis. Primary threat, aerial mobility. I'm a ground fighter. He has total environmental control here. Notes mention turbine intakes as a vulnerability. But how do I get close enough? "Leave those men alone," Izuku said, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. He dropped into a low, ready crouch. "Your fight is with me." The Vulture let out a dry laugh. "Kid, you don't get it. There is no fight." And then he dived. He moved with a speed that was utterly disorienting. He wasn't flying. He was falling with murderous intent. Izuku's spider sense shrieked, and he leaped backward, firing a webline at a chimney to swing himself out of the way. Toombs didn't even try to hit him. He swooped down, the talons on his metal boots snatching one of the stunned thieves from the alley. He soared back into the air, the man screaming in terror, as he dangled 100 feet above the street. "Let him go!" Izuku yelled, his voice laced with panic. "As you wish," Toombs said nonchalantly. And he opened his talons. The thief plummeted, his scream cutting short as he fell. Izuku's mind went blank. All analysis, all strategy evaporated, replaced by the single, overwhelming imperative that had defined his entire life. Save him. He launched himself off the roof in a desperate dive, firing his web shooter. The line shot out, a silver thread chasing the falling man. He was too far. The angle was wrong. He wasn't going to make it. Float. He thought, a desperate, vestigial command. Nothing happened. Black whip. Silence. He was falling, just as helpless as the man he was trying to save. He adjusted his trajectory mid-air, a desperate, flailing movement, and fired again. This time, the web connected, plastering the man's back just as he was about 20 feet from the pavement. The sudden stop was brutal, the man's body whipping around with a sickening jerk. But he was alive, dangling a few feet above the ground. Izuku, his momentum spent, crashed ungracefully into the side of the opposite building, sticking there with a painful thud. He looked down, his chest heaving, to see the second thief running for his life down the street. The one he'd saved was trying frantically to get free of the webbing. He had saved him. But it was a sloppy, reactive save. He had let the villain dictate the entire encounter. He looked up. The Vulture was circling above him like his namesake, his green optics glowing in the dark. "Impressive," Toombs' voice crackled. "But sloppy. The other guy, he was graceful. You're just clumsy." Toombs was toying with him. Humiliating him. Showing him that in this arena, the open sky, Izuku was a rank amateur. And Izuku, clinging to the side of a building, his heart pounding with adrenaline and fear, knew he was right. He had been so focused on stopping street-level crime that he had never even considered a threat like this. A villain who owned the sky. He was completely and utterly out of his depth. Of course. Here is the 5th chapter, a detailed and harrowing account of Izuku's disastrous first encounter with the vulture, designed to be a significant turning point in his journey. The air in the chasm between the buildings was thick with tension, a palpable silence broken only by the low, predatory hum of the vulture's turbines and Izuku's own ragged breathing. He clung to the brick face, his fingers and toes digging into the rough surface, his mind a frantic, chaotic storm. Peter Parker's notes had given him data, schematics, theories. They had not, and could not, have prepared him for the sheer, terrifying reality of Adrian Toomes. The man was a master of his domain. He didn't just fly, he commanded the air, carving through it with an effortless, lethal grace. Every subtle tilt of his wings, every adjustment of his turbines, was the action of a man so intimately connected with his technology that it had become a part of him. Izuku, a creature of solid ground and explosive lunges, felt a profound, primal sense of being out of his element, like a fish gasping on dry land. "You're quiet, kid," Toomes' voice crackled from above, dripping with condescending amusement. He circled slowly, a shark in a three-dimensional ocean, his glowing green optics fixed on Izuku. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just trying to figure out how you gotten so far over your head?" Izuku's mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a strategy, to force the panic down and let the analyst take over. "Okay. Assess. His strength is aerial superiority. My strength is, well, sticking to things, and a short-range explosive jump. I can't fight him up there. I have to bring him down. Get him into an alley. A confined space where his wings are a liability." It was a sound plan. The kind of plan he would have formulated in the safety of his room back at the UA dorms. But theory shattered against the wall of practice. How could he lure a veteran predator into a trap? Toomes wasn't some mindless thug. He was calculating. He held all the cards. "Are you going to just cling there all night?" Toomes taunted. "I've got places to be. Things to salvage." That was the trigger. The word salvage brought Toomes' goal into sharp focus. He wasn't here for a random fight. He was here to make a statement, to prove a point. The robbery attempt in the alley must have been bait, a way to draw him out. This entire encounter was a performance. Izuku pushed the fear aside, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. "Your business is hurting people, Toomes." His voice came out stronger now, the tremor of fear replaced by the steel of conviction. "That ends now." A dry, crackling laugh echoed through the street. Big words from a bug on a wall. Without another word, Toomes banked sharply and dived. He moved with a speed that defied belief, closing the 100-foot gap in a terrifying heartbeat. Izuku's spider sense erupted, a white-hot siren in his skull screaming a single, primal command, "Move!" He shoved himself from the wall, firing a webline at the opposite building. He swung, but it was a clumsy, desperate arc. Toomes was on him in an instant. The razor-sharp edge of a wing sliced through the air just inches from Izuku's head, close enough for him to feel the rush of displaced air and hear the vicious shying of metal. The wingtip clipped his webline, severing it effortlessly. Izuku plummeted. He fell for a terrifying second before his instincts took over. He twisted in the air, firing another web, this one connecting with a fire escape below him. His fall was arrested with a jarring jerk that sent a shockwave of pain through his shoulder socket. He landed in a crouch on the narrow metal platform, his entire body trembling with adrenaline. He had underestimated the vulture's speed, his precision. This wasn't a brawl. It was a surgeon dissecting a patient. "You're quick," Toomes' voice crackled, now hovering level with the fire escape, about 30 feet away. "I'll give you that. But you're sloppy. All raw power and no finesse. The other one, he danced up here. He made it look like art. You just look like you're trying not to fall." Every word was a carefully chosen barb, designed to get under his skin, to make him angry, to make him make a mistake. Izuku knew it, but the comparison to Peter still stung. He was sloppy. He was clumsy, and he hated it. Don't let him bait you. Stick to the plan. Bring him down. Izuku fired 2 webs, not at Toomes, but at a pair of heavy, overflowing dumpsters in the alley below. With a grunt of effort, he ripped them from the ground, his enhanced strength allowing him to swing them through the air like massive, garbage-filled bolas. He hurled them at the vulture. It was a good move, a classic Deku improvisation. Against a ground-based opponent, it would have been a devastating attack. But in the air, Toombs was untouchable. He simply folded his wings slightly, rising a few feet with a casual burst from his turbines, and the dumpsters sailed harmlessly underneath him, crashing into the street below with a deafening clang of metal and a shower of refuse. Cute, Toombs sneered. My turn. He didn't dive this time. Instead, a panel on the underside of one of his wings slid open, revealing a projectile launcher. A single, sleek rocket shot out, trailing a thin line of smoke. Izuku's spider sense gave him a half-second warning. He leaped from the fire escape, pushing off with a small, controlled burst of one for all, launching himself higher up the building face. The rocket slammed into the fire escape where he had been standing, and the world erupted in a ball of fire and shrapnel. The force of the explosion threw him against the wall, the heat washing over his back. The sound was a deafening roar that left his ears ringing. He clung to the brick, his head swimming. This was beyond anything he had anticipated. Peter's notes had mentioned salvaged Chitauri weaponry, but he had assumed that meant energy rifles, maybe grenades, not military-grade explosives. You see, kid, Toombs said, his voice cutting through the ringing in Izuku's ears. I'm not like the freaks you're probably used to. I wasn't born with some special gift. I built my power. I earned it, piece by piece, from the scraps the so-called heroes left behind. This city is a gold mine, and I'm just the guy smart enough to see it. Toombs was monologuing, but it wasn't the typical villainous trope. He was testing, probing, trying to find a weakness. He was analyzing Izuku, just as Izuku was trying to analyze him. It was a battle of wits as much as a battle of strength. Izuku knew he had to change tactics. The defensive game was a losing one. He had to go on the offensive, get in close, and disable those wings. It was a reckless, almost suicidal idea, but it was the only one he had left. He began to crawl rapidly up the side of the building, his movements a blur of green and black. His plan was simple: get above Toombs, then use gravity and a full-power OFA-enhanced jump to dive-bomb him, closing the distance before the vulture could react. Running away? Toombs taunted, easily matching his ascent. Just getting a better angle. Izuku shot back, his voice tight with effort. He reached the roof's edge, hauled himself over, and sprinted across the tarred surface without pausing. He needed a running start. He channeled one for all into his legs, the familiar green sparks, however faint, a comforting sight. He felt the ghost of that immense power surge within him, a promise of what he could do if he could just push past his limits. He reached the opposite edge of the roof and leaped. It was a magnificent, powerful launch. He soared into the air, a human missile aimed directly at the vulture's back. He could see his target clearly now, the central turbine housing, the complex hydraulics that controlled the wings. A few well-placed, web-clogged shots and he could ground him for good. But he had made a critical, fatal error. He had forgotten who he was fighting. He was fighting a man who had spent years battling a hero with a danger sense. Adrian Toombs knew all about precognitive warnings. He knew you couldn't surprise a spider. But he also knew you could overwhelm him. As Izuku reached the apex of his jump, his spider sense didn't just scream. It detonated. It was a blinding, paralyzing flash of pure, undiluted terror from every direction at once. Toombs hadn't tried to dodge. He had been waiting. With a movement too fast to track, he flared his wings, using them as massive air brakes, and spun in the air. At the same time, panels on the top of his wings opened, firing a volley of what looked like dozens of small, metallic discs. They weren't explosives. They were shuriken, razor-edged and spinning so fast they hummed. Izuku was trapped in midair, his momentum carrying him forward into a storm of slicing metal. He twisted, contorted, his body moving on pure instinct, guided by the shrieking of his spider sense. He fired webs in a frantic, wide spray, creating a makeshift, sticky shield. Most of the shuriken were caught, but several got through. One sliced a deep gash in his thigh, another tore through his shoulder, and a third grazed his ribs, shredding his suit and the skin beneath. Pain, sharp and hot, erupted across his body. His concentration shattered. His flight path faltered. He began to fall, no longer a missile but a wounded bird. Toombs was on him before he could recover. He didn't use a weapon. He simply flew past him, and the edge of his wing, as solid and unforgiving as a steel girder, slammed into Izuku's chest. It felt like being hit by a car. The air was driven from his lungs in a single, desperate gasp. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of spinning lights and overwhelming pain. He was vaguely aware of a sensation of rapid ascent, the wind screaming past him, the city lights shrinking below. He came to his senses, his vision swimming back into focus, to find himself in the vulture's grip. A massive metal talon was wrapped around his chest, squeezing the air from his already aching lungs. They were climbing, ascending at an incredible speed, leaving the claustrophobic city streets far below. "You've got guts, kid, I'll give you that." Toom's voice was a low growl, right next to his ear. "But you've got no brains. You brought a fistfight to a dogfight. You never had a chance up here." They broke through the low-hanging cloud cover, and for a moment, the city was gone, replaced by an endless, swirling gray mist. The cold was biting, seeping into his bones. Izuku struggled, trying to fire his web shooters, but the angle was wrong, and his arms were pinned. "Let's see how you handle the real sky," Toom snarled. They burst out of the top of the clouds into the stunning, terrifying clarity of the upper atmosphere. The moon was a perfect, silver disk in a sea of diamond-hard stars. Below them, the clouds were a rolling, white ocean, illuminated from beneath by the glow of the city they hid. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying sight Izuku had ever seen. They were miles high. "Here's the most important lesson you'll ever learn," Toom said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are no second chances." And he let go. The sensation of falling was absolute. One moment he was held fast, the next there was nothing but empty air and a heart-stopping, stomach-lurching plummet. The wind roared in his ears, a deafening, elemental scream. He tumbled end over end, the world a blur of moonlight and clouds. Panic, cold and pure, seized him. There was nothing to web. Nothing to kick off of. Nothing but empty space. His ground-based fighting style, his entire heroic identity, was utterly, completely useless here. He spread his arms and legs, trying to flatten his body to slow his descent, a trick he'd seen on some pre-Quark-era documentary. It barely helped. He plunged back into the cloud layer, the world becoming a blind, disorienting whiteness. Moisture beaded on his mask, chilling his skin. He was going to die. He was going to fall for miles and become a crater on a New York City street. His mother would never know what happened to him. All Might's legacy would die with him, a forgotten secret in another dimension. It was in that moment of absolute despair, falling through a blind, cold nothingness, that a new sensation cut through the panic. A faint, familiar tingle. It wasn't the wild shriek of his spider sense. It was the other one. The one he had inherited. Danger sense. It was a faint, ghostly whisper compared to the spider's scream, but it was there, a single, clear note in the chaotic symphony of his terror. And it wasn't warning him about the fall. It was telling him something else. The low left. He broke through the bottom of the clouds. The city was spread out beneath him again, a glittering carpet of light, rushing up to meet him at a terminal velocity. He was still thousands of feet up, but he could see buildings now, not just lights. And he saw it. To his left, just as the ghost of danger sense had indicated, was the thin, spired antenna of one of the city's tallest skyscrapers. It was a needle pointing to the heavens, a single, desperate point of salvation in a world of empty air. It was his only chance. He angled his body, fighting against the wind resistance, trying to shift his trajectory. It was like trying to swim through concrete. He fired a webline. It flew out, a pathetic, hopeful thread, and was immediately torn away by the sheer force of the wind. Not going to make it. Too far. The despair threatened to swallow him again. But then, a voice, deep and resonant, echoed in his mind. It wasn't one of the vestiges. It was the voice of his master, the man who had taught him what it meant to be a hero. Go beyond. Plus ultra. A surge of defiant energy, born of desperation and love, coursed through him. He reached for one for all, not for a 5% kick, but for everything he could possibly scrape together. He poured all of his focus, all of his will, into his right arm. He saw, for a fleeting, glorious instant, the crackle of brilliant green lightning, brighter than it had been since his arrival. It wasn't 45%, not even 20%. But it was more than a flicker. It was a statement. It was a roar of defiance against the dying of the light. Detroit. He screamed into the wind, the name of the technique of prayer. He fired his web shooter, and as the fluid shot from the nozzle, he channeled the burst of one for all directly into it. Smash! The web line didn't just shoot out. It exploded from his wrist, a cannon shot of polymer, propelled by the force of his quirk. It moved faster than the wind, a shimmering, lightning-infused thread that crossed the impossible gap in a fraction of a second. It connected. The web splattered against the antenna spire with a force that should have shattered it, but it held, the advanced formula Peter Parker had designed proving its worth. The line went taut. The deceleration was the most violent thing Izuku had ever experienced. It felt like his arm was being ripped from its socket. His body was whipped into a dizzying, pendulum arc, swinging at a speed that blurred the city lights into streaks. The G-force pressed him into unconsciousness, his vision tunneling to black. His last coherent thought was a single, grateful whisper. "Thank you, Parker-san." His body, now just a dead weight, continued its swing. It crashed through the window of a lower, unfinished floor of a nearby office building, the sound of shattering glass lost in the constant drone of the city. He tumbled across the concrete floor in a shower of glass and dust, finally coming to a stop in a tangled, broken heap against a pile of construction materials. Silence. He lay there, motionless, for what could have been minutes, or an hour. His suit was in tatters. The gash on his thigh was bleeding freely, a dark pool spreading on the concrete. His shoulder was almost certainly dislocated, and the pain in his ribs was a blinding agony with every shallow breath he took. He was broken. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, propping his body against the steel support beam. He coughed, and a spray of blood spattered the floor. He looked at his trembling hands. He had survived. By some miracle of science, inheritance, and sheer, stubborn will, he had survived. But he had been utterly, comprehensively defeated. He had been arrogant. He had believed that his new powers, combined with his experience fighting world-class villains, made him ready. He had been wrong. This world's villains were different. They didn't have the raw, chaotic power of quirks, but they had ingenuity, technology, and a cold, calculating ruthlessness he was not prepared for. The Vulture hadn't just beaten him physically. He had humiliated him. He had stripped him of his confidence, exposed his weaknesses, and shattered his heroic self-image. He had taken Izuku Midoriya, the hero Deku, and reminded him that he was just a child, alone and out of his depth. He reached up with a shaky hand and pulled off his mask. The cool night air felt strange on his tear-streaked, dirt-stained face. He looked out through the shattered window at the city. It was beautiful, indifferent, and it had chewed him up and spit him out. He had failed. He had failed the city. He had failed All Might. And he had failed the memory of the man whose powers he now wielded. The weight of it all was crushing, a burden far heavier than any physical injury. He leaned his head back against the cold steel beam and for the first time since he was a small, quirkless child, he felt truly, completely, and utterly helpless.